And not all of you know what this conference series is about. It's a conference series called Progressive Governance Conferences that originated at the late 90s, and it was usually hosted by a think tank called Policy Network in London. And we as the Progressive Center, we are very proud that we were able to live up to this tradition, and we are trying to hold up the tradition for the second time now since 2017. And I also want to say that we are very honored that we were able to manage to get, from a German perspective, and for the international audience, I would like to say that we are very honored that we were able to get two of the most successful and influential German politicians here tonight, which is Robert Habeck from the Green Party co-leader. He's sitting over there. Please welcome him. And Stefan Weil, the Prime Minister for Lower Saxony. He will join us a little bit later. Why are we doing this? We feel that now more than ever is the time for the progressive community to come together and exchange ideas. It was hard work to organize this day. I would like to thank especially Dominik Schwickert, the director of Progressives Zentrum, and his team to make this day possible. Let me take the time to make two remarks. One of the first progressive governance conferences that I personally was able to attend was in 2009 in Chile. That was almost exactly to the day 10 years ago. It was a marvelous conference in Valparaiso. If you've never been there, it's beautiful, go there. In this conference, the participants were Joe Biden, the Vice President of the USA, Michelle Bachelet, the President of Chile back then, Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of the UK, Lula, President of Brazil, and among others, Jens Stoltenberg, Prime Minister of Norway. 10 years later now, none of them is still in office, and we have right-wing populist governments in the US and in Brazil, and we have conservative governments in all other three countries that I was just mentioning. So why am I explaining this? As we all know, this shows what we all know, that center-left parties have been in decline in the last decade. And there are many reasons for this. And one particular reason I would like to call the progressive paradox. What do I mean by progressive paradox? On the one hand, the need for comprehensive reforms in different policy fields in our societies, in our countries, is bigger than ever, be it to adapt to changes in our economies, the challenges of global warming or migration. So this is the one hand. On the other hand, the conditions for pushing forward a reform agenda have been worsened tremendously in the last decade. I would like to mention just three obstacles as a starting point for our discussion later. The first obstacle, as I see it, is that our societies have become more fragmented in the last decades, and so have many party systems. And this leads to the fact that in many party systems, one center-left party alone cannot do it anymore. We need allies, we need partners, and that is why we broadened up this conference series and brought together people from different parties, progressive liberals, Greens, from the left party, and so on. Second obstacle to a progressive agenda is, of course, the right-wing populism that we are witnessing in all of our societies, or most of our societies, which are putting democratic institutions themselves under pressure. So, as progressives, we not only have to come up with new ideas, we not only have to win or try to win majorities, we also have to defend democracy itself, which is, of course, time-consuming and costs a lot of energy. Third obstacle, and I come to an end already, is maybe the most difficult for progressives like us. And this is that while there's an abstract desire among the populations for change, we have been discussing this throughout the day. There's a study that you find out there that describes that people actually think things need to change in a certain way. But still, in many countries, and also in Germany, many people do not believe that there will be progress. There's a recent study of the Allensbach Institute, and it says that the share of Germans believing that mankind is developing to an ever better future was 56% in the late 60s and went down, especially in the last decade, tremendously to now 32%. So this is the lowest proportion of progressive thinking in Germany in the last 5 decades. And there's also the problem that many people not only believe that progress is not don't believe that progress is possible at all, they also think that politics cannot come about with progress or is not willing to do so. Interestingly, there's a study published today by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, which finds that now really listen to this, I couldn't believe it, 46% of interviewed people say they believe that there are secret organizations influencing political decisions, and 33% say that politicians are just puppets of underlying powers. So, to wrap up, are those bad times for progressives? Are we doomed, so to speak? We as the Progressive Zentrum, we don't think so. We believe that times are tough, but that we ourselves can do better. It is up to us. That's the point that we would like to make today. So we need to be pushing for change because it's part of our DNA, but we have to do it in a smarter, in a more interesting, a more regardful, more convincing way. We need to stop, we believe, the infighting between center-left parties and allow each other the space each party needs in order to reach overall progressive majorities. We need to learn from positive examples, and we learned today that there are many examples. We need to build more intense networks, we need to become younger, more diverse, we need to reach out to the broad spectrum of civil society movements and activists. And my last point, and we are very proud that this happened today, we need to again strengthen the transatlantic ties. It is very sad, it's a pity that Congressman Tim Ryan needed to cancel his trip to Germany on very short notice due to the political circumstances in the US. But it is very promising that so many of our American friends came all the way to Berlin today. So there are many reasons to be optimistic, and it would be great if this positive signal came out of the conference today. So this was my first initial statement. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite MAJA GÖPEL and Jean PISANI-FERRY on stage.
Should I just start talking?
No, I'll ask you something first. Yeah, MAJA has been around at the conference throughout the day, and I would like to know from her what was her main takeaway.
Good evening. I'm very happy to see so many of you here tonight, and I will try to get the positives out, right? And I'm also very happy to be here because I first came 2 years ago, I think, when it was an urgency call. Someone had stepped out of a panel on justice. And I remember Dominic calling me up, I know justice isn't really at the core of your sustainability thinking, but maybe you could still step in. I was like, hold on, there is something that we need to bridge. And that is the bridge between the environmental and the social, as being two coins of the same side of any progressive agenda that we can talk of as being progressive today. And I think the recent The recent protests have just put more emphasis on this, and this is the kind of angle from which I've been observing the day, and I was very happy that there was an entire panel this afternoon also on just transitions and how do we get into a better energy system and tackle climate change. I also would like to pick up Matthew Taylor's framing from this morning, because he said when we look at research from all different disciplines, there's basically 3 ingredients that make up a successful organization or a successful institution. And one is about hierarchy, then there's a values base, and then there's a degree of individualism. And when those are well balanced, then the institution and the organization can bring about really good change and really deliver on its purpose. And typically we have allocated the authority to the state, and then the legitimacy and values to civil society, and the markets are more the mechanism of bringing out individualism. And I think that is the first message, also to start thinking in alliances that don't fall into the trap of saying, oh, the state has to do this, and then the markets or the economy can do that. There's always a variety of business players. There's always a variety of political parties and ideas about what should be brought about. So how do we combine those assets? And the final bit that he nailed it down to was 3 elements, and I want to use those as a reference then to kind of gel my environmental perspective. One is we need missions that will mobilize people. And missions being something that bring back more the concerns of individuals and of humans into the way of policy making. And this is one of the big challenges for the EU, where a lot of people feel even more remote probably from what is happening there than you've just pointed out. Interestingly, I think it speaks also to the kind of concerns that you've been putting out in the study as of today. So how do we make sure that it doesn't feel detached and manipulated from the people? Then we need a new idea of individualism, one that is not so fundamentalist as we might have had it, and the marketization of basically all of our relationships, to really think about which type of relationships might we want to demarketize a little bit. And then the need for new democratic innovation and the renewing of the hierarchical leadership legitimacy. So what is it? Which kind of institutions and governance can be leading this change and this transformation today? And as a scientist that likes to look at how people make sense of the world, I would like to put forward a few observations to just wrap up and lead us into the discussion, to really think about the discursive face of politics. I think we've had it in a few moments today. How do we describe things? What are the words that we use? This is going to open up an imaginary space in people's heads, and it is going to invite value judgments. And this is why it is really important to think about how do we frame those missions. And I think it does cut short, and we had it in some of the panels, to try to use the old metrics, the undifferentiated way of saying growth, the undifferentiated way of saying productivity gains, in order to justify progressive politics. And that's been a challenge that we've had, the structural power of the status quo, just because it's there, with the reference frameworks and the indicators and the metrics of what is successful, they are there, and everything that wants to deviate from that has to argue why the deviation is not going to be hampering, and use the benchmarks that are part of shaping and expressing the status quo. So we have to say our idea of the future is not going to be expressed by the same metrics. This mission needs new way of measuring and of valuing, and we have to put those forward to say this is where the solutions lie. And the ones that are saying that want to keep the system as it is, they should tell us how that impacts our metrics of a progressive solution that is socially and environmentally sound. And then for the new idea of individualism, we talked about this, and I think there is an interesting overlap that came between decarbonization and digitalization, which is really that we need to have an individualism that is connoted with something that you are part of something bigger. It can be what Antonia Kwame Appiah calls the rooted globalism or rooted cosmopolitanism, so some degree of feeling responsible for, also for the elites that have the possibilities to float around the globe. And at the same time, the leave no one behind agenda that we talk about in the just transition and the sustainable development goals. And when we see at the antagonism against the changes, we do see a little bit of the same patterns in digitalization, where we saw a lot of the people in the productive and manufacturing really don't liking that type of progress, and the decarbonization, where obviously the people falling behind when we are changing those kinds of jobs. So how do we make sustainable business models? How do we show those? How do we measure those? What are the reporting schemes? How do we make sure that everybody can make a sustainable living in the future? And how do we avoid the sentiments of being transformed in inviting everyone that's most affected into being part of the transformers? And with this is the final bit, the democratic innovation. How do we get out of the dictatorship of the present, of having to argue against old, outdated metrics and very economistic mindsets? How do we invite in something bigger? And how do we make sure that the stories that are being told, and I think this is something I'd love the political panel to address. My feeling is that a lot of the people don't believe the stories of everything can be staying more or less the same anymore anyway. So how do we honestly say what has to change and then find the coalitions that reliably are going to go for that target whilst constantly adapting to include the people's concerns that are affected most? So that would be for me the progressive story for the future.
Thank you very much for this very energetic and dense. Is this working? Yeah. I would now introduce Jean PISANI-FERRY. The funny thing was, he has been around in major government positions, both in France and in think tank positions in Europe. Many of you know him. And I asked him, what do you want to talk about? And he said, I want to talk about climate change and how the people react to it. So it fits perfectly with MAJA. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think I know the reason why you invited me, because when you spoke about pessimism in Germany and about the conspiracy theories, you needed someone who comes from a country where things are worse. So I'm here. I can tell you it can be worse. No, I wanted to talk about climate change because I wanted to talk about something, you know, about which we have to think hard because it's critical and because it's difficult. It's critical because it has to do with the view about the future, about progress. And it's difficult because we're seeing how easy it is to have a split between the people who care about the end of the world and the people who worry about the end of the month. And that's exactly what we're seeing, we've seen happening in France with the divide between those who took the roundabouts because they didn't want to pay the carbon tax and those who said we need to act and we need to act now. So first question is what to do about that exactly. Who should pay for the transition? And I think we do need a carbon tax. This is essential. I mean, you're not going to change your behavior if the prices give you the wrong signal. You're not going to change your heating system. You're not going to change your car. You need the prices. But at the same time, those taxes are extremely regressive. So there needs to be a way to compensate people. The US proposal for carbon dividends is very interesting. Essentially to give back the entire proceeds from the carbon taxation to the people on a per capita basis. So this can correct the distributional bias, the inequality bias in the carbon taxation. But there are many other dimensions for people, for example, people who live in cities, in places where they're much more dependent on carbon, on car, on heating, etc. So there needs to be ways to redistribute. And I think there needs to be a clear proposal. Otherwise, we're not going to have carbon taxation. It's going to be defeated. And without carbon taxation, we're not going to succeed in the transition. So that was my first point. My second point is a very un-German one. We're here in a country that's obsessed about schwarze Null. Now, Germany borrows at 0.03% on 10-year bonds. So not 3%, not 0.3%, but 0.03%. So zero, okay? Inflation exists. I mean, it's somewhere between 1% and 2%. It means Germany borrows at negative rate. And there is no discussion about how to share the burden between today and tomorrow, between the present generation and the future generation. Now, are we sure that the future generation will be happy to inherit a deteriorated environment, but perfectly healthy public finances? I mean, are we sure? I don't think it makes, in principle, economic sense. So I think we need to have a serious discussion about how to share the burden across generations. And especially in this kind of environment in which we have a window of extremely low interest rate, it's not going to last forever. So I don't want us to regret in 10 years, 20 years, say, oh, we had this window, we didn't use it. It doesn't mean fiscal profligacy. It doesn't mean, to use it as a pretext for overspending, but it means a serious discussion about that. My last point is perhaps a tribute to the American friends who are here. I'm deeply convinced that by the day the US changes position on climate change and joins the Paris Agreement, a nanosecond later, they will start talking about border tax adjustment, about saying, we're not going to let people who don't participate in the effort against climate change, just sell us on the cheap goods that have been produced, with carbon emission. So we need a serious discussion on the linkages between climate change and international trade. And this is very delicate in this type of environment in which we are seeing the rise of protectionism. This shouldn't be left to the protectionists, but those who care about both a multilateral system, a rule-based order, and climate change should have a serious discussion about the role for border tax adjustment. It shouldn't be left aside. So 3 hard problems: the distributional effect of taxes, the burden sharing across generation, and the international dimension. And I think we're not yet at a point where we can see there are clear ideas about those 3 issues. Thank you.
Thank you, John.